The winter wind of 1944 swept across Eastern Europe like a cold blade, cutting through flesh and hope. Snow covered the landscape like a white sheet over a dead body. Beautiful from a distance, but full of scars hidden beneath its icy surface. World War II had already lasted more than 5 years. The world was weary. And amidst that weariness, the battle lines had transformed into open-air cemeteries. At the turn of December, German soldiers retreated through the forests of East Prussia. The ground was frozen, the rivers stagnant beneath layers of ice, and the villages reduced to smoldering skeletons. With each step, the crunch of ice under their boots mingled with the distant sound of Soviet artillery, advancing relentlessly. It was the end of an empire disintegrating before their very eyes. Among the men of a worn-out company, a young soldier walked silently. His name was Wilhelm Adler. He was only 22 years old, but his face betrayed a man who had aged centuries. His eyes were deep-set, surrounded by shadows that the cold could not explain. He no longer carried the rigid posture that instructors demanded in his glory days. He walked hunched over, as if the weight of war had settled on his shoulders. Wilhelm was drafted at 18 in 1940. When he left, Germany still marched confidently, believing the world would be conquered in months. The streets of Berlin vibrated with flags, speeches, and promises. But now, 4 years later, only the echo of a dream turned nightmare remained. The promised millennial empire crumbled into ruins, and every soldier tasted the bitter flavor of defeat even before hearing the word surrender. Wilhelm's company was lodged in a small abandoned village. Roofless houses, torn-off doors, frozen wells. The smell of smoke and gunpowder still permeated the air, mixed with the odor of bodies buried under the snow. The nights were long and silent, interrupted only by the distant whistling of bombs. Food was scarce, the water was melted ice. Hope was non-existent. That night he sat beside a broken wall, his hands covered in rags. He pulled a small, crumpled piece of paper, a worn pencil, and a carefully folded envelope from his backpack. It was the same sheet he had kept for weeks, but now he was determined to fill it. It was his last refuge against madness, to write what still remained inside him before the world swallowed him whole. While the other soldiers slept, Wilhelm watched the soft flame of a candle flickering in the wind. The sound of the wick crackling mingled with the creaking of the floorboards and the heavy breathing of men dreaming of the past. Outside, the cold lashed against the broken walls and caused ice to form in the cracks of the ceiling. With each gust of wind, a sound like a groan echoed through the shelter, as if the earth itself lamented what it saw. Wilhelm remembered home, a simple wooden house, a white fence, the smell of bread his mother made on Sundays. His father, a quiet man, repaired tools in the barn, and Anna, his fiancée, embroidered handkerchiefs by the window. He had promised her he would return before Christmas 1941, but that Christmas never came. Others had passed, and now time had lost its meaning. He thought about how much the world could change in such a short time. Where there had once been laughter, now there were only orders. Where there had been faith, now there was only obedience. The uniform he wore seemed to weigh more each day. Not because of the fabric, but because of what it represented. The swastika on his arm no longer symbolized pride, but shame. The memories came in waves. He recalled the training, the youthful enthusiasm, the fiery speeches of the officers promising victory and eternal glory. He also remembered the first shots fired, the first bodies falling, the first eyes he learned to avoid so as not to go mad. And now, in the deadly cold of a lost war, all that remained was the desire to remember who he was before all of this. He wasn't sure how many more days he had to live. The orders came in a jumbled mess. Resist until the end, hold position, retreat, then attack again. The commanders no longer had plans, only despair. The Reich was melting like ice in the sun. Wilhelm picked up the paper and with trembling hands began to write. Each word came out as if torn from his chest. He wasn't writing to be read. He was writing so as not to disappear. In the letter there was no patriotism, no resentment, only confession. He spoke of constant fear, of the feeling that humanity was being lost forever. He spoke of the noise of the bombs, the screams, of the comrades who died with their eyes open, as if they were still searching for heaven. As he wrote, the distant sound of artillery echoed. He paused for a moment and looked out the broken window. The horizon flickered with artificial lightning, explosions in the distance. The war still breathed, hungry. He resumed writing, trying to ignore the trembling walls and the bone-chilling cold. There was something almost sacred about that simple gesture. In a world consumed by brutality, writing a letter was an act of resistance. It was saying to time, "I existed." Wilhelm knew that he might never be able to send it. The military mail service had disappeared, the roads were destroyed, and chaos reigned. But he continued, letter by letter, as if each stroke could hold him for a few more moments in the world of the living. Outside, the wind picked up. The trees swayed like ghostly shadows. A dog howled in the distance, lost among the wreckage. The cold seeped in through the cracks and made the sail falter. "And yet," he wrote. When he finished, he looked at the envelope. The recipient's name, Anna, was blurred by the touch of his cold hands. He carefully folded it and placed it inside his jacket, over his heart. He lay there for a few minutes, motionless, listening to the sound of his own breathing. That night, before blowing out the candle, Wilhelm had the feeling that the whole world held its breath with him. War might rage outside, but inside that shelter for a few moments, everything was quiet. It was the silence before the storm. The last breath of a man who still believed that somehow love would survive hate. Dawn arrived colorless, as if the sun itself were too tired to illuminate that end of the world. The sky was a thick, heavy gray that seemed to crush the earth. Drops of ice hung from the twisted branches of the trees, transforming the forest into a crystalline cemetery. The wind blew through the ruins of the village, carrying with it the dust of destruction and the dormant smell of death. Wilhelm woke up before the others. Sleep was no longer rest. It was an uncomfortable interruption between nightmares that resembled real life. He rose slowly, feeling every bone protest. His body seemed ready to give up, but his mind refused to succumb. The letter kept close to his heart was his only flame, small but alive. As he walked among the rubble, his eyes scanned the surrounding scene. Entire houses had vanished, reduced to fragments of stone and charred wood. The village church, which may once have rung bells for weddings and births, was now nothing more than a crooked, black tower, silhouetted against the sky. The altar was buried under ashes. Even God seemed to have left that place. The war no longer followed rules. There were no longer defined fronts. Chaos was the only commander. Entire families fled without knowing where to go. Lines of civilians crossed frozen roads, pushing makeshift carts with all that remained of their lives. The soldiers watched helplessly, knowing they could not protect them. They could barely protect themselves. Wilhelm bent down to retrieve an object half buried in the snow. A broken wooden toy, perhaps a horse. Teeth marks on the side showed that a child had played with it not long ago. The toy was stained with a dark red mark. War didn't choose who to take. He left the object there and moved on, his chest heavy with the truth he had never been able to accept. There wasn't enough innocence to escape that hell. The sound of shuffling footsteps drew closer. Other soldiers were waking up. They were gaunt figures, ghosts in soiled uniforms, all with the same expression, a cruel mixture of fear and resignation. Military discipline had crumbled like wet paper. They no longer marched in ranks. They merely moved as best they could, guided by aimless commands. The radios brought fragmented news, almost always worse than imagined. Lost cities, entire divisions decimated, units ceasing to respond. The German war machine, once proud and efficient, now dragged itself along like a wounded animal. The Soviets were close, and the cold made sure to remind them of it. That stretch of East Prussia had been taken and retaken so many times that the soil no longer knew who it belonged to. Bullet holes marked every wall. The ground was littered with empty ammunition and grenade casings. The blood had already been absorbed by the earth, but it remained there in other forms. In memory, in the air, in constant fear. Wilhelm thought about how the speeches he had heard years ago now sounded like delusions. The leaders who spoke of absolute victory were not there with them. They did not feel the pain that pierced through worn-out boots. There in Berlin, they ate at tables surrounded by maps, pushing soldiers around like pieces on a chessboard that no longer represented anything real. He remembered the day he left for war. The train whistle. Anna's smile. The flowers falling from the window. He remembered how he imagined returning stronger, with medals on his chest. However, now, if he ever returned, perhaps he would have no face. Perhaps he would have no soul. The cold seeped through the fabric of the uniform and burned his skin. Wilhelm rubbed his hands vigorously and looked around. Each soldier tried to keep busy because stillness meant thinking. And thinking hurt. Some mended boots with scraps of old canvas. Others sharpened bayonets they might never have a chance to use. Most just stared blankly into space, as if they had already said goodbye to their own lives. In the distance, the deep sound of engines briefly broke the silence. Heads snapped up. For a moment, everyone held their breath. It could be artillery, it could be the enemy advance, but it was just a German convoy, disorganized, heading nowhere. Rusty trucks and damaged tanks, passing by like ghosts of lost battles. Wounded men, bandaged, lying as if they felt nothing anymore. A nearby soldier held a rosary between his fingers. His lips moved, forming a silent prayer. Wilhelm watched him, thinking about how faith was perhaps the last piece of humanity trying to survive there. But even faith seemed to tremble before that reality. In the last trees before the road, black crows perched in rows, observing everything with cold eyes. They knew. The war had fed them too well. Nature, indifferent to any flag, always won in the end. Wilhelm ran his hand over his jacket, feeling the envelope beneath the fabric. It was his shield against despair. As long as the letter existed, he could still remember who he was. Love still existed within him, even if the world tried to tear it away piece by piece. The commander approached and delivered curt orders to the group. They should retreat a few more kilometers that night. There was no strategy, only survival. The objective was simple: not to be crushed when the Soviets arrived. The troops set off, leaving behind that already dead village, like so many others that didn't even have a name on the map. The road was narrow and slippery. The snow hid holes, wreckage, unexploded mines. With each step, danger disguised itself beneath the innocent white of winter. Wilhelm kept his eyes wide open, but something else caught his attention. Traces of blood mixed with the footprints. Red drops that told a short and cruel story. Someone had been dragged along the road, someone who would probably never have a grave. The sky began to darken earlier than expected. Winter was keeping pace with its own clock. Shadows stretched across the landscape, covering everything in a bluish darkness. The cold intensified, as if trying to drive the intruders out of that territory. The group found shelter in another destroyed village at nightfall. The houses were nothing but stone shells. The doors were broken, windows shattered, furniture reduced to makeshift firewood. Still, it was a better refuge than the open road. Wilhelm watched the stars appearing in the sky, small and distant, like powerless witnesses to human tragedy. He thought about how Anna saw those same stars, perhaps at that very moment, perhaps with tears in her eyes. Deep down, they all knew their fate was sealed. But as the world crumbled, each clung to what remained of themselves. Some to faith, some to anger, and Wilhelm to the letter in his chest. Before going to sleep, he took a deep breath and looked around. It was a strange irony to realize that the men who were there, dressed as enemies of humanity, were also victims. Many didn't even know why they were fighting. They were fools, swept away by a river of blood that began long before them and would end long after. The flame of a makeshift bonfire flickered, casting distorted shadows on the crumbling walls. These silhouettes seemed to dance in despair, as if trying to escape the war and death that were inexorably approaching. Wilhelm closed his eyes for a moment and felt his heart beat against the envelope. There was still life there. And as long as there was life, the letter had meaning. The war was at the zenith of its collapse. The empire that had vowed to dominate the world was now fighting only to survive another day. And Wilhelm Adler, a soldier lost in the midst of history, prepared to face the inevitable, because the world was definitively in ruins. The wind cut like a blade. Dawn brought only a cold, pale light, barely distinguishable from the night. The shadows still clung to the frozen ground, as if refusing to disappear. The group advanced slowly, stumbling over roots and debris. Each step sounded like a protest against their own existence. The war had transformed men into machines and machines into nothing. Wilhelm walked in silence. The weight of his backpack seemed to increase with each passing hour. But the true weight came from within. He felt the invisible burden of memories he couldn't erase. With each shard of memory, something cut him from the inside. Someone's face. A child's cry. The empty gaze of a companion who didn't reach the end of the road. He remembered one day in particular, months before. A village taken. The command had given direct orders. No civilians should remain. It was the kind of order no one wanted to hear, but no one dared question either. Wilhelm obeyed. Everyone obeyed. The smell of smoke and gunpowder mingled with the muffled cries of those trying to escape. He tried not to look, but he did. And what he saw haunted him to this day. A boy of perhaps 10 years old ran, holding a dirty doll in his hands. Wilhelm hesitated. It was too late. A gunshot rang out behind him. The boy's body fell, and with it, something inside Wilhelm that would never rise again. From that day on, he knew he was fighting a war that was already lost, even if the map said otherwise. Now, months later, the ghost of that boy still haunted him. Sometimes, at night, he would hear light footsteps in the snow and swore he could hear the sound of a distant laugh. Short, innocent, cruel, his mind played games to survive, but also to punish him. The group arrived at an open field. In the distance, the skeleton of an old factory could be seen. This was the place where they were to await orders. The air smelled of rust and smoke that never dissipated. They entered through the broken windows and found shelter among the abandoned machines. The walls were covered with bullet holes and hastily scribbled phrases in different languages. Shouts frozen in time. Wilhelm stepped away from the group and sat in a dark corner. He took off his helmet and ran his hands through his soot-stained hair. For a moment he let the silence envelop him. But the silence of war was not peace. It was a heavy echo, made of memories and regret. He took the letter from his inside pocket. The paper was already yellowed, stained by moisture and body heat. Still, the scent was the same. Anna's faint perfume, mingled with the touch of time. He didn't need to open it. He knew every word by heart. Come back to me. No matter how long it takes, no matter what happens, come back. But he no longer knew if he deserved to return. A metallic clang interrupted the reverie. One of the soldiers had dropped a box of ammunition. The sound echoed too loudly and everyone flinched. Fear was an automatic reflex. The enemy could be anywhere, even in their own shadows. Outside, a thick fog began to cover everything. Visibility dropped to just a few meters. The cold bit deeper. Wilhelm looked at the horizon and thought about the absurdity of that war. Men killing each other without knowing why, while the world outside continued spinning, indifferent. Suddenly, a distant gunshot broke the tense calm. Then another. Artillery. The sound came from afar, but it was enough to remind them that peace was a temporary lie. The group prepared themselves, gathering their belongings. Wilhelm remained motionless for a few seconds, watching the smoke rise on the horizon. He no longer feared death. What terrified him was the idea of surviving. In the following nights, sleep became a battlefield of its own. He saw faces, the boy, fallen companions, even enemies he had never met. In his dreams, they all looked at him the same way, with silent eyes, as if expecting an answer he couldn't give. One morning he awoke breathless, his heart racing. The campfire had gone out and the others were asleep. The letter had slipped from his pocket and lay on the snow. Wilhelm picked it up carefully, as one might hold something sacred. There, alone, he understood what tormented him. It wasn't just the guilt of having survived, but the guilt of having forgotten for a moment why he was fighting. War turned everything into numbers. Casualties, ammunition, kilometers conquered. But behind each number was a life, a story, a letter written by someone who waited in vain. He looked up at the sky and saw the stars, faint and hidden behind the clouds. How many men on both sides would be looking at the same sky? How many letters were being written at that very moment, with the same naive hope that it would all be over soon? Wilhelm closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The memory of Anna returned like a flash of warmth amidst the ice, the sound of her voice, the touch of her hands. For a few seconds the world seemed bearable. But then came the dry crack of a gunshot in the distance. Then another. The sound reverberated off the factory walls. Everyone awoke with a start. The enemy had arrived. Chaos ensued immediately. Orders were shouted, footsteps rushed, the clinking of cartridges being loaded. Wilhelm threw himself behind a pile of rubble, his heart pounding. Smoke filled the air. The first impact made the ground tremble. Glass shattered. Men screamed, some wounded, others struggling to maintain their sanity. War had found them again. For hours the shooting was constant. A deafening noise interspersed with explosions that made the air seem to vibrate. Wilhelm fired almost mechanically, without thinking, without feeling. It was instinct, pure survival. At a certain point he lost track of time. The world had become an endless sequence of gunshots, screams, and smoke. When all was silent, it was already dawn again. The factory was destroyed. Few had survived. Among the scattered bodies, the snow began to fall again, covering the dead with a white blanket, as if the earth itself were trying to hide humanity's shame. Wilhelm was alive, but something inside him was no longer. The dried blood on his hands was both hot and cold. He looked around, not recognizing the place. The letter was still in his pocket, intact. Perhaps, he thought, that was what was keeping him breathing. War had a cruel way of teaching. No one came out of it without carrying the dead within them. Wilhelm rose slowly, staggering, and left the ruined factory. Dawn was beginning to break again. The same cold sun, the same gray landscape. But now, each step he took left deeper marks. It was as if the ground was pulling him down, exacting the price for every sin he had pretended to forget. The weight of guilt wasn't something you could see. It was something you could hear in the silence. And in that silence, Wilhelm walked, a man who no longer knew if he still deserved to go home. The sound of the wind echoed like a whisper of lament among the devastated fields. Winter was no longer just a season. It was a living, cruel entity that seemed intent on erasing any trace of humanity from those lands. The once fertile ground had become a mixture of mud, blood, and hardened snow. War had devoured everything: forests, villages, faces, names. Only traces and ghosts remained. Wilhelm walked among the ruins, accompanied by a small group of survivors. There were fewer than 20 now, men who had once been part of an entire troop, but whom the war had swallowed like the sea swallows ships. Their faces were hollowed, their eyes sunken in a void where faith once existed. Hunger was a constant companion. The cold, an enemy that never slept. But still, they marched, without a clear direction, just away from the sound of gunfire. The radios had been silent for days. No orders, no commands. The army had dissolved like smoke. Germany, once a proud empire, was now a decaying corpse, and each soldier was a forgotten piece of that carcass. Wilhelm no longer fought for his country, nor for honor. He fought only to remember his own name, to not forget that he was still human. Torn boots cut through the ice like blades. The wind carried the distant sound of explosions. No one knew from where, nor by whom. The front had dissolved everywhere. No one knew anymore who was winning or fleeing. They were simply dying. With each kilometer they left something behind. A wounded comrade, a rifle that was too heavy, a piece of hope. On the third night of their march, they found an abandoned barn. The partially collapsed roof allowed a view of the sky. Wilhelm looked at the stars, the same ones he had seen months before. They were identical, cold, impassive, eternal. It was strange to think that while the world of men was collapsing, the universe remained unchanged, indifferent to the madness down below. Sitting on a bale of straw, Wilhelm opened the letter again. The words trembled beneath his fingers. It was the same delicate handwriting, the same strokes that held the warmth of home. He wondered if Anna was still alive, if she had managed to escape the bombs, if, somewhere, she was still waiting for him. When you return, I want you to bring a stone from wherever you are on the road. I want to keep it as a reminder that you walked to me. That sentence struck him. Wilhelm plunged his hand into the snow and picked up a small, icy, smooth stone. He kept it with the letter. It was a foolish gesture, perhaps, but it was a symbol, a silent promise that there was still a way back, even if he didn't know where it ended. The following dawn brought with it an eerie silence. No sound of artillery, no echo of engines, only the wind. The group advanced, hesitant, like those who tread on sacred and dangerous ground. The roads were littered with the carcasses of burned-out tanks and dead horses. Uniforms were mixed together, Soviet, German, civilian. The war no longer distinguished sides. Everything was gray. Everything was the same. At one point they found a village still standing, almost intact. It was rare. The houses were empty, but the smell of burnt bread still lingered in the air. There were signs of a hasty escape. Inside one of the houses, a table was set, 2 chairs were overturned, and a broken cup lay on the floor. It was as if time had stopped the moment fear crossed the threshold. Wilhelm ran his fingers over the cold wood of the table. That scene seemed more tragic than any battlefield. While the others searched for food, he went upstairs. In the room he found a cracked mirror. He approached slowly and looked at his own reflection. What he saw was no longer a man. He was a shadow of his former self. Sunken eyes, sparse beard, an expression of exhaustion and pain. The war had consumed him, chewed him up, and returned him as a distorted memory of what he once was. He placed his hand on the mirror, and for a moment, he had the sensation of touching another world, one where Anna still awaited him on the balcony, in her white dress and with her gentle smile. But the crack of the ice breaking brought him back to reality. The image vanished. Only the lost soldier remained. Upon going downstairs, he found a diary on top of a broken piano. The pages were stained, but some sentences could be read. "They are coming. I'm taking my children. May God have mercy on those who remain." Wilhelm closed the notebook and left it where it was. War spared no stories. It simply interrupted them all. Days passed. The group continued marching, always westward, fleeing the shadow that grew behind them. The cold worsened. The food had run out. Men fell in the snow and never got up again. Wilhelm tried not to count how many. To try to count would be to admit that there was still a future. One morning, as the sun rose like a golden blade on the horizon, they heard gunshots in the distance, not from intense combat, spaced, dry shots. Executions. Wilhelm ordered silence. They followed, crouched down, up a snow-covered hill. Upon reaching the top, they saw what remained of a surrendered German column. Men kneeling before Soviet soldiers. No screams, only the sound of gunfire and bodies falling in the snow. Those who had once sworn to fight to the end now begged for mercy. Wilhelm looked away. There was no longer any honor, only survival. When night fell, the group took shelter in a ruined church. The open roof revealed the starry sky. The walls still displayed fragments of burnt frescoes. Faceless angels, shattered saints. Wilhelm sat down where the altar should have been. Slowly he took out the letter and read it for the 100th time. Each word seemed like a whisper from a world that no longer existed. He knew the end was near. I knew that this might be the last night. Around them, the few remaining soldiers slept. The silence was almost sacred. Wilhelm took the stone from his pocket and held it between his fingers, feeling the cold pierce his skin. A stone on the road, wherever it may be. Perhaps that was the final road. When dawn arrived, there was no sign of life around. The wind blew harder, as if wanting to clear the landscape. Wilhelm stood up, put on his helmet, and adjusted his rifle. He looked at the horizon where columns of smoke still rose. He took one step, then another. He was marching alone now. Each step was more difficult than the last. My legs felt heavy. My breath was short. But he continued, because the letter on his chest still propelled him forward, as if those words were a compass. A reminder that there was still something greater than war. Love. In the distance, the sound of engines. Soviet tanks. Wilhelm knew what that meant. He stopped. He looked at the sky one last time. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled. He hid the letter on the ground, under a stone. The same stone from the road. After that, he continued walking towards the sound, until he disappeared into the snow. The echo of his footsteps was the last sound before everything fell silent. The dawn was gray, heavy, and silent. The field, shrouded in mist, resembled a cemetery without tombstones. Bodies, wreckage, and memories mingled in the cold mud of devastated Europe. The soldier was breathing heavily. His uniform was torn, soiled with dirt and dried blood. The war was over for many, but not for him. There was still something to do. Something that kept him standing, even when everything around him was crumbling. He pulled the crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, the same one he had kept since the first day of combat. It was on paper, the last letter. The letters are almost faded, but still legible. He opened it carefully, as if touching a reliquary, and began to read softly, his voice hoarse, amidst the cold and the pain. Dear Mother, if this letter ever reaches your hands, it will be because time no longer belongs to me. I saw the sun rise and set over hell. I watched friends leave and dreams vanish into thin air. But still, I want you to know. I fought to the end with a heart full of love, not hate. It was love that kept me alive when all seemed lost. My love for you, for our home, for everything I left behind. He paused. The distant sound of isolated gunshots still echoed, but it no longer frightened him. Now fear had given way to something more serene. Acceptance. Tell the woman I love that her face was the last image I kept in my memory. And if I don't come back, I want her to know. With every sunset, I'll be watching over her. In every flower that blooms among the ruins, there will be a little of my hope." The words trembled. The paper, wet with tears and dew, almost crumbled between her fingers. He gazed at the horizon. The same horizon from which, years ago, he had set off, full of dreams and promises. Now, that horizon seemed the same one that had been calling him back home, just in a different way. "Don't cry for me. If there's one thing I've learned in this war, it's that hate never wins over love. They can destroy cities, families, memories, but they can't erase what we carry in our hearts. And mine, Mother, has always belonged to you." He finished reading and, with what little strength he had left, put the letter inside a small metal box. He buried her under a mutilated tree in the middle of nowhere, not to be forgotten but to be found, one day, by someone who still believed in humanity. The wind blew, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. A tired but genuine smile. Because somehow, he knew that letter would survive time, war, and death. The sound of distant bells announced the end of the fighting. World War II was drawing to a close. But for the soldier, the true victory was not over the enemy, but over his own fear. As the sun rose behind the mist, illuminating the devastated fields, he lay down. He looked up at the sky and murmured, "Now I can rest." The wind carried away his last words. And in that profound silence, something changed. The earth seemed to breathe again. Days later, when the rescue troops arrived, they found the small metal box. Inside, the letter, intact, capturing in a few lines the portrait of a soul that never gave up on love, even at the ends of the earth. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment saying how you felt while listening to the last letter. Enjoy the video and subscribe to the channel for more exclusive, moving, and human accounts of World War II. Each new video is a journey through lost memories, silenced voices, and stories that time tried to bury, but that we together bring back to life.